In this presentation, I will deal with planning of a nuclear medicine department, including both a diagnostic and a therapeutic department. To do this, I will review with you the categorization of department. I will discuss the general concept of operation of a nuclear medicine department, taking into account the principal and also the supporting process. I would like to recall with you some comment about the balance that is necessary between human and technological factors. Then the real body of the presentation will be on the discussion of the characteristics of the main areas, on the systems and finishes that we need to have a proper installation. And at the end, I will show you some example of practical realization of departments. The reference documents for this presentation are the IAEA Safety Standards SSG 46, that is a very relevant document descending directly from the IAEA BSS, so a very important document in the literature of the IAEA. But there is also another important document that is the Nuclear Medicine Resource Manual, the 2020 edition, has a full chapter on the design of new department. This presentation takes a lot of material from it. And then there is also an interesting publication of the ICRP that is particularly interesting for us as regards the therapy wards. The categorization. Well, the IAEA suggests that the nuclear medicine department should be categorized in different levels of increasing complexity, and so increasing more and more requisites as regards the site planning and the constitution of the real facility. At the level 1, we have a relatively simple department like the one that can be encountered in a first or second level medical facility, while at second 2, at the level 2, we will have a structure that start to have complex equipment, like in example, SPECT camera. And at level 3, we will have a complex department with more than one scanner, including SPECT-CT and PET-CT. The categorization applies also to therapy departments. And at level 1, we find departments that do only outpatient service, so have a minimal requisites for the facility, while at the therapeutic level 2, we have inpatient treatment with a ward and all the complexity that this means. The general concept, generally speaking, according to the IAEA SSG 46, in a nuclear medicine department, typical, we should have several types of areas like source, storage, and preparation, that is frequently termed as the radiopharmacy laboratory, rooms for the administration, uptakes room in order for the patient to get the proper biodistribution of the radiopharmaceutical after the administration. Then we will have the imaging room, and we can have also some sample measurement in vivo, like with radioimmunology assays that in some part of the world continue to be quite vital. Then we will need all the ancillary areas like waiting areas, changing areas. Not to be forgotten, radioactive waste storage and management is very important. Then we will need image processing. It is to be considered that, as we will discuss more in depth in the following, that some level of separation will be necessary in many areas. In example, waiting areas for patients before and after the administration of the radiopharmaceutical should be separated in order to better organize the flux of work and avoid unnecessary irradiation of the patient. In the case of therapy, dedicated ward are necessary, and it is also to be remembered that in the facility, in a typical nuclear medicine department, there will be also functions that are hosted in rooms that do not require any presence of radiation. In example, offices, reporting area, some staff rooms, they do not need to be inside the radiation area of the department. The principal process in general is the imaging process. And this is well known, but let me recap the main component of this. So the patient is typically referred to the nuclear medicine in order to receive an examination. And upon its arrival, the patient is received. Some administrative work is made by the secretaries. And then the patient is directed to a waiting area. At this point, it will be a so-called cold waiting area, so without radiation. Prior to imaging, the patient is called inside the radiation area of the department, and in this area, in a specific room, is administered with the radiopharmaceutical. Then, depending on the type of the examination, there can be an immediate scanning or a certain waiting time to get the proper biodistribution, and so the patient is to be accommodated in a separate hot waiting room. Then the patient goes to the imaging room, the images are acquired, and then the patient may wait for to be released from the department. And in the same time, the digital images will be transmitted to different computers, will be elaborated, reviewed by the physicians in a specific room, and any eventual post-processing is applied. And while the patient already released, has been released by the department, from the department, the images will be recorded and stored. It is to remember that in advanced tertiary hospital, particularly in teaching hospital, but frequently also in PET centers, there can be the need of more technical space in order to host small working groups that are participating in the consulting of the images, in the interpretation, in image manipulation. Because in this type of facility, it is quite frequent there, let's say they are like a sort of point of attraction for the colleagues also of other areas to come see the cases and discuss with the nuclear medicine physicians. In designing all of this, it is important, particularly for us medical physicists, that we are fond about sophisticated high technology equipment. So we see the scanners like top level equipment, and we really work with them with a passion. But we should not forget that for the patient, the same type of equipment that for us is a source of enthusiasm in doing our work may be a stressing factor, because they are not familiar at all with this big-sized moving equipment, and the patient is in a condition of vulnerability during his permanence in nuclear medicine. Is ill or is suspected to be severely ill, and it can be stressed, can be not confident on what is going on, and frequently we ask them to take out part of their clothes. So there is also a problem of let's say, dignity, and we have to try to design our nuclear medicine facility accommodating both all the necessary requirements for the technological equipment for radiation protection and safety, but having in mind also that we are not dealing only with equipment, but we are dealing with people, with sick people frequently, and so they require all of our attention and a certain type of balance between the different requirements. One of the key points in the design of a nuclear medicine department is try to organize well, properly, possibly in an optimized way, all the different fluxes that cross the department. First of all, we have the fluxes of patients and staff. And we have to remember that the patient, during most part of his permanence in nuclear medicine, is a walking radioactive source, after the injection of the radiopharmaceutical, the patient is emitting significant amount of radiation, so that we should try to have separation as much as possible between the circulation of the patient and the staff, and try to avoid as much as possible backflow of the patient. So the patient going back from the initial direction, and instead they should go and never walk back. Also, we have other fluxes like incoming and outcoming material. Basically, in example, we may have radiopharmaceutical arriving and radioactive waste exiting. And so we should try to keep all these fluxes well organized and possibly separated. Also, we have to consider that there will be, apart the nuclear medicine properly said staff, there will be also other staff coming from other departments. In example, medical physicists may be pertaining to a separate department, but we may have colleagues coming from radiology, radiotherapy, oncology, cardiology, endocrinology, coming to contribute in some way to an examination, so that frequently this type of staff may require dedicated spaces. So it is useful for us in the design phase of a department to try to imagine all the movement, all these different fluxes of staff, materials, patients, and try to draw them on a plan of the department. This is an example of a relatively small facility with 2 PET CT scanners. I try to describe you the concept. You can see here that we have arrows and lines in different colors that describe the flux of the staff, the flux of the patient, and the flux of the products. So we have the general entrance, the radiation area begins here, and we have externally from the radiation area a toilet, and we have a secretary office. Then the patient enter in the radiation area, they are visiting room. And after the first contact with the physician, the patients are sent in one or the other administration room. Here, not shown in the map, there are movable lead barriers to insulate the patient from each other. And the radiopharmaceutical in this facility is coming from the bottom floor, where there is a big radiopharmacy, through a lift. So the nurses call for the dose of the radiopharmaceutical. They receive the dose in a lift, they bring to the appropriate injecting room, and they inject the patient. After waiting time, the patient is called in one scanner or the other, and after the examination, the patient goes to the exiting area. Before exiting, may wait for on a chair for a few minutes, just to receive the initial information. Your study was okay, you can go home, and then the patient exit in a completely different area, so that we don't have any overlap between the cold patient and the hot patient after the examination. And this type of drawing is particularly useful. In example, this is another map of a big radiopharmacy, in order to allow us to draw in colors the different area with different type of classification, including radiation classification, but also pharmaceutical classification, and also to draw the different, with a color code, the different type of clothes that are requested in different areas in order to get proper and safe operation. The area should be classified for radiation, and for radiopharmacy need also a specific classification for the pharmaceutical aspects. As stated in the SSG 46, rooms for the preparation of radiopharmaceutical, the administration, hot waiting room, storage of the radiopharmaceutical, as well as storage of waste, imaging rooms, and wards for therapy should be controlled area, while supervised area may include area with uptake probes, corridors, so the surrounding and ancillary areas. The entrance of the patient to the department happens through a reception area, in which we should host the patient initially, And it is also the occasion for giving patient information. There should be leaflet, informative material, and also it is requested to be signage, so that limiting the entrance to radiation area when not necessary. Please be aware that the type of information vehicled by this type of signage telling that it is completely forbidden the access to pregnant patient is fundamentally wrong. The ICRP and the IAEA suggest that the information given is if you are pregnant or you may be pregnant or you are lactating, inform the staff, because this is the key message. The staff can decide if the patient is appropriate to access the department or not, because there are situations in which it is appropriate to perform a scan also to a pregnant patient. In example, for studying an embolia after an incident, a car crash, and in this situation, a perfusional lung scan may be the most indicated type of scan to be performed on a pregnant patient, so that it is to be careful to not give wrong information, but try to give appropriate information to the patient. After the reception, the patient is sent to an administration room. The administration room ideally should be in close connection with the radiopharmacy, should not be inside the radiopharmacy. First of all, we should have a separation between what is a laboratory area and what is an area for patient. But it is not only a matter of mental order, it's a matter of pharmaceutical regulation that we have to consider together with radiation protection regulation, and it is a matter also of properly hosting the patient in a dedicated room, in which, in example, there can be fitted all the materials and gases that are necessary in case of an emergency that may always happen in a medical facility. In order to realize the proper communication between the laboratory area and the administration room, so-called pass-through boxes are a very good solution. You can see here that this is not vented, while this grid tells you that this is a vented PAX box, and they may be necessary depending one or the other, depending on the type of pharmaceutical classification of the laboratory. If we go back, we can see that in the case of administration of radio aerosol, special ventilation may be necessary, and this, in example, may take the form of a dedicated spot for air extraction to be positioned close to the mouth of the patient during the administration of radio aerosol. This because the patient is not completely safe. He may release some of the aerosol during the administration phase, so to avoid any risk of contamination, to have a dedicated ventilation system is recommended. As regards the radiopharmacy laboratory, the IAEA, in its operational guidance for hospital radiopharmacy, give a classification of increasing complexity going from operation level 1, that is substantially dispensing ready-to-use radiopharmaceuticals, to level 2, that is the most general situation in which one labels kit of technetium based on the elution of a molybdenum generator, going to level 3, in which there is the synthesis of more complex radiopharmaceutical, like some specific therapeutic preparation, or the synthesis of PET radiopharmaceutical starting from raw materials. In radiopharmacy's laboratory, there should be a mean to prevent the access, and also at the entrance, there should be an area in which all the necessary protective clothing, that in this case is not shielded clothing, is protecting from the possible risk of contamination, should be worn by the staff. Then there should be shielded storage for the radioactive sources, workstation and dot cells for the manipulation, and proper collection of the radioactive waste. It has to be considered that radioactive waste should not be hosted, if not really for very temporal period of time just after the preparation, within the clean area of the laboratory, to get a good separation between clean product and waste. Also, it is to be noted that according to the European GMP pharmaceutical regulations, within a laboratory area, there should not be sinks, drains, showers. This should be in close communication with the laboratory for proper decontamination in case of any problem, but should not be really inside the laboratory. As regards drain pipes, the recommendation from the IAEA SSG 46 is that they should go as directly as possible to the sewer in order to avoid any backflow, avoid any accumulation in the pipes itself. Nevertheless, in some countries, may be necessary to collect all of this in specialized delay tanks. I will come back on this point also later, speaking about therapy wards. Hot waiting areas should be ready to host patients during the waiting time after the administration, before the real performance of the scan, and they should be safe for the patient and trying also to entertain the patient during his waiting time in an appropriate way. So, in example, it is possible to provide a television in order the patient to be distracted watching a movie or something similar. But also vice versa, it is necessary for the staff to have a video control of the patients in order to grant safety of the patient. They are in hospital for some reason, so they may be ill, they may suffer some incident during the permanence in the hot waiting area. So if they are continuously monitored, this will greatly increase their safety. In the hot waiting area, there should be dedicated toilet facility, and it is another occasion in order to provide the patient with information boards, etc., for give them proper information on the practice that they are undergoing. The diagnostic room have a lot of requisites. Well, first of all, the last in my bullet list is structural shielding. I will not deal with the detail of structural shielding in this presentation because this will require another full presentation. It is the case in this occasion simply to say that structural shielding should be planned and approved by a qualified medical physicist or radiological protection expert as appropriate and depending your national regulation. But apart shielding, diagnostic room have a lot of requisites. In particular, the floor should be carefully leveled in order to host properly the scanners, and should be reinforced in order not to present any structural problem when hosting a scanner that may weigh more than 2 tons, maybe around 3 tons, concentrated in about 1 square meter, so that particularly resisting floors are necessary. Also, SPECT-CT and PET-CT scanner may require spatial ventilation in order to remove the heat released to air, but some scanners may have an extra chiller that has to be properly hosted in a small dedicated technical area. They can be also installed within the diagnostic room, but this is not always suggested because these type of devices are noisy, so they may interfere with the normal activity and may disturb the patient, so that a proper insulated room close adjacent to the scanner room is the suggested solution. Furthermore, it is always to be considered per gamma cameras that it is necessary to have all the proper space in order to allow the movement of the bed, and particularly the movement of the collimator cart from their storage position to the collimator change position. Toilet and services in nuclear medicine department should be clearly separated for patient and for staff, and it is quite clear in order to avoid any non-justified risk of contamination. Waste collection room should not be a non-qualified room. So let's say the worst room that you have is dedicated to the collection of waste. this is not the real good solution. Actually, the room for the storage of the waste should have several qualified characteristics. In example, a secure door, because waste at the end are radioactive source, so they should be protected against any possible interference of people that is not authorized. They should have adequate lighting in order that when the staff access the room to see properly the products, the containers, be able to read labels. The electrical system should have a high degree of protection, and there should be a fire extinguishing system in place, because in case of fire in a waste collection room, there may be spread of activity, as well as there should be a mean for containing against floods. To have water pipes inside a waste room, it is not recommended, but in case, containment against flood should be always present in order to avoid any unintended spread of radiation in case of incidents. Rooms for therapy. Rooms for therapy can be contiguous to the diagnostic department, but in many cases, they are even at a certain distance, and they may be placed in connection with other wards. In example, a frequently applied solution is that this is a dedicated area close or within an oncology ward, so that the nurses can rotate between one and the other type of department, having clearly their proper classification and their proper dosimetric monitoring. But this makes some synergy in the use of the staff, and particularly during night shift. And so this is a frequently solution that is adopted. The access to the therapy room should be controlled. Once again, a system for remote patient control not only helps to grant safety of the patient, but also allows for the staff to monitor the patient, speak with the patient, check their general condition, avoiding continuous access, so that optimizing the exposure of the nursing staff. Depending on local regulation, could be necessary to collect the discharges from the rooms. There is not an international standard about this, and it has to be noted that the IAEA do not recommend the installation of waste collection tanks. What should be respected in any country is the clearance level for wastes after they release into the environment. In the case of volatile radionuclides, and this is the frequent case of iodine-131, the most important therapy radionuclide, there should be a specific ventilation, since the patient release some iodine-131 with their breath, and so there can be a contamination of the air, so that it is necessary that there is a good air extraction fitted with appropriate filtering, like charcoal filtering. Structural shielding, once again, should be approved by a medical physicist or radiation protection expert, and I will come back discussing the example to all these points even later. In therapy rooms, it may be necessary or would be optimal to have also a dedicated room for the people that cares and comfort the patient. This is particularly the case in the situation of therapy to pediatric patients, but not only. And just to show you an example of the proper organization of the planning, one can adopt a worksheet in order to have a definition of all the areas that are necessary, parameterized according to the number of the diagnostic room, in example, the number of scanners in a room, define the minimum and maximum number of staff that are working in an area, and the minimum and maximum number of patients that can be hosted in a room, so that to make a preventive evaluation of the minimum and optimal area for operation. And summing all of these aspects allows you to make, let's say, a general forecast of the spaces necessary, and this can be useful in order to clarify the concept while discussing with engineers and architects in the design phase. And this also apply with the specific parameters and requirements to therapy wards. Let's now give a look to some specific details and finishes in the construction. Let us speak about floors. In all the radiation area, but in particularly in radiopharmacies, in administration room, in stress testing room, in hot waiting area, in diagnostic room, and in waste storage, floors should be decontaminable. So they should be realized possibly in sheets of plastic material welded each other in order to be continuous and do not have any discontinuity that may allow for the formation of deposit of any residual of contamination. These are examples made with normal PVC tiles that can be welded, and which elements can be also rounded in order to facilitate the covering of the walls in order to allow for easy cleanability in these areas. Also, sealing are important in general because we are using equipment that is frequently noisy, and so that maintaining the level of noise to an adequate level is something that helps the staff to work in a acceptable condition, also not only from the radiation point of view, but from the general behavior of the staff. But in some specific areas, like in radiopharmacy laboratory, we have a very precise requirement of isolation of the laboratory area from the space above the false ceiling. So this should be welded, continuous, sanitizable in order to avoid any entrance of powder and other materials from the top of the ceiling to the real laboratory area. And this is an example of a structure made by a frame with aluminum elements, aluminum tiles that are then welded or glued with silicone in order to avoid any entrance of dirty air, of uncontrolled air from the top space to the laboratory area. And this is another example. You can see also here the rounding of the corner in order to facilitate cleaning and decontamination. All of this material came from the pharmacy world. In the pharmacy industry, it has been developed a series of material that are very useful in order to grant proper decontamination. Thinking in their case, in the pharmacy industry, to microbial contamination, but the same category of thinking and the same type of products are also very useful to prevent or facilitate the remotion of radioactive contamination. So all this material for the wall, protection of the wall are really useful, and you can find that there is a lot of easy to install material that can be used in a new facility, but also to when reforming an existing area that was not dedicated to nuclear medicine in order to solve many problems that they may be present in a non-dedicated area. So you can see that you can have materials like this, cover for the corners, and also the vice versa, convex elements that help the rounding of corners, and all of these basic material that can be covered with the tile of the floor. And you have that there are prefabricated wall, pharmaceutical wall that are of typical thickness of 45 millimeters and are made with a melaminic plastic material, and inside they have some phone-absorbing insulating material, and they can fit also, if necessary, lead shielding. So this is a very useful choice for radiopharmacy laboratory, and not only. It is important to remember that the ventilation system in a nuclear medicine department is as important as shielding, if not even more. It is possible always during the life of a department to change the shielding, to improve the shielding, to add some further shielding without major problem. But if the ventilation system has not been conceived and designed properly in the beginning, this is really a major issue. The ventilation system should avoid any air recirculation. The air in a nuclear medicine department is potentially contaminated, so any recirculation should be avoided. All the air in input should be properly filtered in order to avoid the excess of powder that may damage our precious equipment, and in radiopharmacy to avoid any possible external contamination, not radioactive, but conventional contamination. Also, the exhaust clearly should be appropriately filtered in order to avoid any undesired release of radioactivity. The grades of ventilation for pharmaceutical operation here summarized from the Annex 1 of the EUDRALEX GMP regulation of Europe is typically met by realizing high flux of air with high filtration and using specific material that they like the easy decontaminable and cleanable material that we discussed in the previous slides. And as I said also in another presentation about unsealed sources, there is not a real conflict between radiopharmacy regulation and radiation protection regulation, because all the reference documents like the ICRP, the IAEA, and the GMP regulation of Europe give clear indication that there are all the technical possibility in order to have a proper compromise between the requirement for negative pressure in radiation area and the requirement for positive pressure in some area of the radiopharmacy laboratory. And these taken from the Nuclear Medicine Resource Manual edition 2020 are some recommendation on the type of differential pressure, air changes, and type of filtration that you have always to cross-check against your national regulation. Also, the doors in a department are not a trivial material. They should be not only clean, decontaminable, but they should be in many cases secure in order to avoid non-desired access to the general area of the department, but also to very specific area. Like in example, I have already spoke about waste, radiation waste area, to the scanner rooms, or in example to the room in which it is hosted a computer server. So all of this should be secure. Please note that in international recommendation, there is not the requirement to have micro switches in order to interlock the status of the doors in function of the emission of radiation or less. This may be required at a national level, but is not recommended nor by the ICRP nor by the IAEA as strictly necessary, may be required at a national level. I have already commented this point on the security of access that may apply not only for security of sources, but also for security of information, like in the case of PACS servers, etc. And we have to remember that the electrical power requirements are very stringent for modern equipment. They may require an absorption of 30 kilowatt per hour, particularly during the phase of the CT scanning for multimodality equipment. UPS is highly recommended not to support for long time operation of the scanner in case of blackout, but at least to absorb very short blackouts, discontinuity in the mains, or to allow the staff to properly turn off the equipment, avoiding any shock due to the quick discontinuity in the power. I'm approaching the conclusion of my presentation, and I would like to show you some examples, particularly of therapy rooms. This came from my hospital in Bologna. This is the entrance of the radionuclide therapy, small department. We have a shielded room. You can see here in this corner, there is a radiation monitor checking the door. It is calibrated with a properly set the threshold so that if a patient inadvertently exits from the department, an alarm is produced and the nurses can check what is going on. This is the general corridor after that door. Here we have a sequence of 3 therapy rooms, and on the other side we have an area for the nurses and a small visiting room. You can see here there is also a decontamination shower with a Geiger-Müller counter ready to be used in case of necessity. This is a typical room in which we have the bed. The bed, after the mattress, have a shielding of 1 centimeter lead, and also around the bed there are these movable panels with shielding that allow, let's say, to personalize the shielding around the patient. This is the toilet. It is in normal material. The floor is contaminable. And we have, in this case, due to our national regulation, a decay tanks system. You can see that on top of each bed, there is a radiation monitor that is focused, let's say, on the body of the patient and allows to check if the patient is in bed. And also this information can be used sampling at appropriate times to measure the whole body retention curve of activity in the body of the patient. This is the workstation that allows the nurses to monitor the rooms, to receive the signal for all the dosimeters, and also this is the panel of the system of tanks with that collects the radioactive waste. This is another example from the institute in Meldola, Forlì, that is a specialized institute, particularly in radionuclide therapy with innovative emitters. And this is the interior of the department. We have 4 rooms with sliding doors. And this is a typical room. Since they are specialized in beta therapy, in beta radionuclide therapy, here there is not any specific shielding because in the beds and around, because the radiation emission for patient is quite limited. We are at the level of a diagnostic nuclear medicine patient. Everything is well equipped and in easy decontaminable material. You can see also the table and this cart. Everything is of easy decontaminability. You can see the type of floor, and this is the toilet. Once again, is a simple normal toilet, but everything is covered in easily decontaminable and washable material. This example came from an hospital that is specialized in therapy for pediatric patient, particularly iodine-131 MIBG for neuroblastoma. That is unfortunately illness that it's particularly the pediatric age and has excellent results at the therapy. You can see that here there is a bed with heavy shielding all around, and all the toilet is easy decontaminable, etc. And also we have a small room to host the parents of the children so that they can shift in assisting the children or defatiguing in this small area in which they can also prepare some food for themselves or share the meal with the kid. And this is from the Dana-Farber in Boston. When they hospitalize a small patient, they have selected a variety of toys in easy decontaminable material that is given as a kit to every patient entering the department so that he has all the time to spend in playing while receiving the therapy. And at the end, the material can be decontaminated and brought to home with the boy itself. And the final 2 slides are just to recap everything and say hello from my side is the Department of Nuclear Medicine in Bologna, from which I came. This is the ground floor, a very big radiopharmacy laboratory, about 500 square meters, including the bunker of the cyclotron with the production lab and the QC lab and the research lab, a filter room in order to enter, allowing a proper pharmaceutical classification, all the necessary ancillary room, as well as a physics laboratory with counting equipment for us, the physicists. And in the upper floor, there is the nuclear medicine department with 4 PET-CT scanners, 2 SPECT-CT scanners, a small SPECT laboratory for the generators, visiting room, and all the reviewing room, computer room, and ancillary spaces. So this is the end of my presentation. I would like to thank you very much for your kind attention, and I hope that there will be the possibility of discussing your question in the near future. Thank you very much.